Albert Camus quotes in context, deconstructing his most powerful quotes. The Life and Works of Albert Camus. Albert Camus, 1913 to 1960, was a hugely influential French-Algerian novelist, essayist, playwright, and philosopher. His life and works are deeply intertwined with the existentialist movement, though he rejected the label, preferring to be identified as an absurdist. Born into poverty in colonial Algeria, Camus experienced firsthand the stark realities of social inequality and injustice. His working-class background and the early death of his father significantly shaped his worldview. Camus' major works like The Stranger, The Plague, and The Myth of Sisyphus explore the concept of the absurd, the conflict between humanity's inherent desire for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference. Camus' philosophy emphasized individual responsibility, ethical action, and the importance of human connection in the face of absurdity. He rejected both nihilism and blind faith, advocating for a committed engagement with life's inherent contradictions and the constant pursuit of meaning despite its inherent lack. His works remain widely read and studied, continuing to inspire discussions about philosophy, literature, ethics, and the human condition. He is considered one of the most significant thinkers and writers of the 20th century. The Stranger, 1942, in his seminal novel, The Stranger, Camus introduces Meursault, a detached individual who lives a life devoid of emotional depth and meaningful connections. Meursault's indifferent response to his mother's death and his subsequent murder of an Arab man on an Algerian beach serve as stark illustrations of the absurd. The novel delves into themes of alienation, indifference, and the consequences of living in a world without inherent meaning. Meursault's detached narration and his acceptance of his fate, even in the face of capital punishment, challenge conventional notions of morality and justice. On Meursault's detachment and indifference, Maman died today, or maybe yesterday. This opening line immediately establishes Meursault's emotional detachment. The sun was beating down on my forehead. This seemingly simple sentence illustrates Meursault's focus on sensory details rather than emotional responses. It recurs throughout the novel, highlighting the oppressive heat's impact on his actions and perceptions. I didn't cry. I felt nothing. This blunt statement underscores his lack of conventional grief following his mother's death. I knew that I'd be acquitted, that it didn't matter. This quote shows Meursault's lack of concern for the societal and moral implications of his actions. On the absurdity of existence, what was important was the fact of death. Meursault's focus on the physical reality of death, rather than its emotional or spiritual meaning, points to his absurdist perspective. I felt that the sky was immense and empty. This conveys a sense of vastness and meaninglessness of the natural world, reflecting the indifference of the universe to human concerns. It's a habit I have, to never think of the future. This showcases a focus on the present moment, which reflects a disengagement from conventional notions of planning and ambition, a characteristic associated with absurdist thinking. On Meursault's trial and societal judgments, it was the heat, that's all. Meursault's explanation for the murder emphasizes his indifference to deeper motivations. The simplicity contrasts with the gravity of the situation and the complex judgments made during his trial. I was simply trying to live. Meursault's simple defense highlights the absurdity of a trial that focuses more on his character than the actual crime. On the acceptance of fate, I had wanted to live, then I wanted to die. I hadn't even been convinced of wanting to die until my execution. Meursault's ultimate acceptance of his fate illustrates the indifferences he feels towards existence. Mother is dead. So what? This brief, stark statement embodies Meursault's detachment from conventional emotional responses. The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, Camus further explores the concept of the absurd in his philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Drawing on the Greek myth of Sisyphus, condemned to eternally roll a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down, Camus presents a powerful metaphor for the human condition. He argues that life is inherently meaningless, but instead of succumbing to despair, individuals should embrace the absurdity of existence and find freedom in revolt. Sisyphus, Camus suggests, finds meaning not in the futile task itself, but in his defiant struggle against the absurd. On the absurd, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. This sets the stage for Camus' exploration of the absurd, framing the question of suicide as the central philosophical problem. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. This concisely defines the core of the absurd as the tension between humanity's search for meaning and the universe's indifference. The absurd is not in man, nor in the world, but in their presence together. This highlights the conflict arises from the interaction between the human and the world, not from inherent flaws within either. On revolt and defiance, revolt is the only truly serious answer to the absurd. This emphasizes rebellion as the necessary and essential response to the absurdity of existence, not passivity or despair. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This famous concluding sentence is not a literal assertion of happiness, but an affirmation of the freedom found in persistent and conscious defiance of fate. It's the active rebellion, not the result, that matters. On the importance of life and freedom, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This reiterates the focus on the act of rebellion itself as a source of meaning. Freedom is nothing but a chance to live. This emphasizes that the opportunity to engage with life, even a meaningless life, is the value that must be protected and fought for. On the search for meaning, we shall never know whether we are free or not, but we have to live as if we were. This signifies the importance of living in accordance with one's values and choosing a path of action, irrespective of whether true freedom exists. It is an ethical imperative. The Plague, 1947, The Plague, serves as an allegorical representation of the human struggle against suffering and oppression. Set in the Algerian city of Oran, the novel depicts the outbreak of a deadly plague that forces the inhabitants to confront their mortality and the fragility of human existence. Dr. Rieux, the protagonist, embodies the spirit of revolt as he tirelessly combats the plague, driven by a sense of duty and compassion. His actions symbolize the human capacity for resilience and solidarity in the face of absurdity. The novel explores themes of collective responsibility, the importance of human connection, and the search for meaning in a world ravaged. On the absurdity of the plague and the human condition. The plague is a fact of nature, and there is nothing to be done about it. This early statement bluntly introduces the absurdity of the situation, a random and devastating event beyond human control. It sets the tone for the novel's exploration of the human response to the inexplicable. What was to be feared was not the pestilence, it was the human heart. This passage suggests that the true horror lies not in the disease itself, but in humanity's capacity for cruelty, indifference, and self-deception during times of crisis. On Dr. Rieux's commitment and compassion, he knew that he would never be able to explain this to anyone, but he would keep on fighting to the last breath. This exemplifies Dr. Rieux's steadfast commitment to his work, even though the scale of suffering seems insurmountable. It highlights his defiance against the indifferent nature of the plague. The only way to fight the plague is to fight the absurdity. Rieux's actions symbolize an ongoing struggle against absurdity and the human condition. On the importance of solidarity and human connection. It was not a matter of heroism, but of solidarity. This showcases how the collective effort against the plague underscores the importance of community and shared responsibility in facing adversity. The truth is that everybody is always responsible for everything. The widespread nature of the responsibility, reflecting Camus' philosophical perspective on collective human fate and action in the face of crisis. On the search for meaning in the face of suffering, there is no question of heroism, only of duty. Rieux's actions highlight the concept that duty and moral responsibility, not grand heroism, is what matters when confronted with existential challenges. We must keep fighting for those who have fallen. This focuses on the act of doing good as a way of fighting the absurdity and creating meaning amidst the suffering. This showcases the commitment to morality and collective resistance. On the nature of hope and despair, we must find hope in the face of despair. This statement exemplifies the philosophy of actively choosing hope despite suffering, acting according to morality. The Rebel, 1951. In The Rebel, Camus delves deeper into the concept of rebellion as a response to the absurd and injustice. He examines various forms of rebellion throughout history, from individual acts of defiance to collective revolutions. Camus argues that true rebellion is not about nihilistic destruction, but about affirming life and fighting for a more just and humane world. He cautions against the dangers of revolutionary violence and totalitarian ideologies, which he sees as perversions of rebellion that ultimately lead to oppression and the negation of human values. On the nature of rebellion, the only way to fight the plague is to fight the absurdity. While technically from the plague, this encapsulates the spirit of rebellion in the Rebel as well. It illustrates the necessity of conscious action against the irrational and unjust. The fight against absurdity and injustice is a continuous battle. On the limits and dangers of rebellion, the revolutionary, who does not know where to stop, is on the road to totalitarianism. This warns against unchecked rebellion and highlights the dangers of revolutionary movements falling into tyranny and oppression in the quest for power. Camus saw totalitarian regimes as perversions of true rebellion. Revolution is a violent and tragic business, even when it is undertaken for a cause that is just and noble. The problem is not to avoid violence completely, but to limit it to what is absolutely necessary. This passage emphasizes the inherent conflict between the desire for justice and the potential for violence to escalate out of control. It expresses the need for a responsible and well-defined strategy in revolt. On the importance of ethical frameworks and human dignity, the Rebel is not a destroyer, but an affirmation of life. He affirms life by defying the absurd and unjust. This summarizes Camus' view of rebellion as a positive force, not merely destructive. It asserts that genuine rebellion centers around affirming the value of human life and challenging injustice. The true revolutionary will never sacrifice the lives of human beings for the sake of an idea. This highlights Camus' strong emphasis on human dignity. The ethical framework he advocates for places the well-being of individuals and collective humanity above any ideological goals. On the relationship between rebellion and freedom, freedom is not simply the absence of constraint, but the ability to choose responsibly and according to one's values. Camus does not advocate for nihilistic freedom. Rather, true freedom involves conscious choice and actions guided by ethical considerations. It is a freedom of conscience and individual responsibility. The Fall, 1956. The Fall delves into the depths of human psychology, exploring themes of guilt, self-deception, and the search for redemption. Jean-Baptiste Clements, a former Parisian lawyer, narrates his descent into moral ambiguity as he confronts his past failures and his complicity in the suffering of others. The novel introduces the concept of the judge penitent, a figure who simultaneously judges himself and others while seeking forgiveness. This concept reflects Camus' evolving views on guilt and responsibility, suggesting that true self-awareness requires acknowledging one's own flaws and accepting the burden of human fallibility. On Clements' guilt and self-deception, I'd like to be able to say that I was tempted, that I succumbed to temptation, but it's not true. There is no question of temptation. It's something much simpler, much more profound, the fear of being judged. This passage reveals Clements' deep-seated guilt and his inability to confront it directly. His self-justifications are thinly veiled, highlighting his self-deception and moral ambiguity. We're all murderers, and we're all judged, and we're all guilty. This recurring theme underscores the concept that everyone is morally flawed and complicit in the suffering of others. Clements' self-judgment is both self-serving and universally applicable. On the judge penitent and universal guilt, I've never understood those fellows who say, "I'm not a criminal." They must think themselves quite unique. Everyone is a criminal, my friend. Everyone's guilty. So what do you mean when you say that? Clements sees himself as representative of all humanity, sharing a fundamental and universal sense of moral corruption. I've turned judge, but I'm the one who's on trial. The core of the judge-penitent concept is captured here. Clements simultaneously judges himself harshly while simultaneously needing to be judged himself. This duality highlights the inherent contradiction of judging others while being incapable of excusing oneself. On the nature of justice and redemption, I knew well enough that all was not lost, but I failed to act. Clements' failure to intervene in the drowning of the girl is a pivotal moment. His inaction leads to profound guilt. The fall isn't simply a single event, but a gradual erosion of morality. I'd simply like to say that I know, and I believe that you know, that each one of us bears the burden of this universal guilt. This encapsulates Clements' core belief. The concept of universal guilt isn't nihilistic despair, but rather a call for self-awareness and a recognition of shared human responsibility. On the power of confession and self-awareness, there's no point in thinking of the consequences. The point is to confess everything. Confession for Clements is not just a religious act, but a quest for self-awareness and a means of attempting some form of reconciliation with the world. His confession is presented as an effort to share his burden, although it's questionable as to the extent of that sincerity. Exile and the Kingdom, 1957. The collection of short stories in Exile and the Kingdom further explores themes of alienation, exile, and the search for belonging. These stories, set in various locations, depict individuals grappling with feelings of displacement, isolation, and the challenges of finding meaning in unfamiliar environments. Camus' exploration of these themes reflects his own experiences of exile and his growing awareness of the complexities of human identity in a world marked by cultural and political divisions. On the search for meaning and purpose, the world is filled with people trying to find meaning, yet so many are content with illusions. This reflects the general dissatisfaction Camus highlights, particularly with those who cling to false narratives rather than confronting the absurdity of existence. This isn't a direct quote from a specific story, but reflects a recurring idea. On violence and its implications, violence is a failure of imagination, of understanding. Though not a direct quote, this encapsulates the moral implications Camus explores in stories where violence erupts from misunderstandings, political tensions, and the failure of communication. This sentiment is pervasive throughout many of the narratives. on human relationships and solidarity. The only hope lies in the connections we form with each other, in acts of kindness, and in shared struggles. Again, this idea is not a direct quote, but a summation of the many ways that human bonds and connections are highlighted within the stories as counterpoints to the isolation and existential struggles of the characters. On the absurd and the search for meaning. There is no inherent meaning in life, but we can still create our own meaning through our actions. This is a paraphrase to capture the recurring theme of finding purpose within the absurdity of existence. Many of the stories depict characters struggling to come to terms with the inherent meaninglessness, but still seeking ways to construct a worthwhile existence. Caligula, 1944. Caligula, a play set in ancient Rome, depicts the reign of the Roman Emperor Caligula and his descent into tyranny, driven by a nihilistic worldview and a thirst for absolute power. Caligula's actions become increasingly absurd and destructive. The play explores the corrupting influence of power, the limits of freedom, and the consequences of embracing a philosophy of nihilism. On Caligula's nihilism and rejection of meaning. Since I've discovered that life is absurd, I shall do everything I can to make it so. This embodies Caligula's radical rejection of traditional values and morality after his sister's death, embracing a nihilistic pursuit of power and cruelty. On the corrupting influence of power and the absurdity of existence, I have understood that there is no future, no hope, nothing but an appalling void. Therefore I shall live as if everything were possible. Caligula's nihilism doesn't lead to passivity, but rather to an extreme exercise of power, demonstrating the absurdity of life when meaning. The embrace of absurdity is not a retreat into despair, but into a type of radical, chaotic freedom. Power is nothing but the ability to do what one wills. This simple declaration showcases how Caligula defines and exercises his power. His actions later directly contradict this belief, revealing his ultimate inability to achieve true power. On Caligula's desire for transcendence, I want to be like the gods, all-powerful, yet fully human. Caligula's attempt to create a personal mythology and transcend the limitations of mortality is central to his character. His cruelties are driven by a frustration with his mortality and his desire to control what he cannot. On the nature of freedom and morality, the only true freedom is the freedom to do whatever you will, even the most unjust thing imaginable. Caligula's concept of freedom is an extreme form of radical liberty. However, it ultimately leads to despotism and cruelty, not to the kind of freedom that respects human dignity. On the human condition, if death is the only certainty, then why not make the most of this life, no matter how absurd it may seem? This summarizes Caligula's position to live life in an extreme way due to his nihilistic view of life's absurdity. I hope you enjoyed these quotes of Albert Camus.